Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
The first barrier, which falls in the category where potential mates are unable to meet with each other, is the geographical isolation. As the name suggests, the barrier is in the form of geographic or the physical barriers. If two populations are unable to meet with each other because of the existence of any physical or geographical barriers in the form of a mountain range, a desert, thick forest or river kind of examples, there is no mating possible within them because they are unable to meet with each other. For example, the northern spotted owl, which stays in the western coast of America. It has very characteristic genetic and the phenotypic differences from its close relative, which is called as Mexican spotted owl, which resides in the southern part. So here you can see this is the northern spotted owl and here it is the Mexican spotted owl. Both are genetically as well as phenotypically different now because they do reside in two different places which are geographically isolated. They are unable to meet with each other and hence mating is not possible between these two. So they represent an example of geographical isolation or barrier between two species. The second category is also a type of geographical isolation, but unlike the previous isolation where there was a mountain, river or desert or such kind of physical barriers were there, here the barrier is in the form of distance as such. So the long distance between two potential mates acting as a barrier to meet with each other and hence the mating is not possible. So geographical isolation, which is because of the long distance within the animals, there is an existence of barrier in the form of distance. And this barrier generally occurs in the organisms which are having sedentary habits or which have limited mobility powers. Because of this, they are unable to cover these distances in order to meet with each other or to have the process of mating with each other. You can assume an example where the tortoises are residing. Tortoises are slowly moving organisms. Or on the other hand, you can take the example of sedentary marine organisms which are attached to the substratum and they are not preferring to move to the places. Now these organisms are hardly able to cover the distances to meet with their potential mates. So they do represent an example where distance in itself is acting as a responsible factor for not allowing the mating between the potential mates. The wide range of examples can be the barnacles, mollusks, ascidian, tortoises, etc. etc. Moving ahead, there is third category of barriers between these in this category is called as habitat isolation. If two sympatric species occupy different habitats, means the species which are residing at the same place but they do occupy different habitats, they rarely meet if at all. Though there is no physical barriers in the form of mountain, river or distance is existing as such, still because of occupying different habitats, they are unable to meet with each other. For example, let's take the example of garter snakes, which is the Thamnophis. They live in same geographical area, but one is terrestrial in nature and other one is water dwelling. Here you can see this is the Thamnophis which is water dwelling. So the preferred habitat for this particular organism is water. Whereas the Thamnophis, which is terrestrial in nature, they prefer to stay on the land. So it is very unlikely that these two forms would prefer to meet with each other for the purpose of mating. Though they are at the same place, there is no physical barriers as such, but the habitat here is acting as a barrier. Next category is temporal or seasonal isolation. As the name suggests, it has to do something with the time or season, and this time or season is of breeding particularly. So the species that breed at different times of the day. For example, one species prefer to breed during daytime, another species might be preferring to breed at the night. Some might be preferring morning time, some preferring evening time, and so on. Or there can be preference in terms of seasons. Somebody prefers to mate in the late summer, the other one prefers to mate in the late winter. Or there can be difference with respect to years. So different species preferring to mate in different years. Such organisms or such species face this kind of barrier for successful mating. For example, the geographical range of eastern and western spotted skunk overlap in North America. The eastern skunk is also called as Spilocale gracilis, that is its zoological or biological name. The western spotted skunk is Spilocale gracilis. So the putorius mates in the late winter, that is the preferred time for mating for the putorius. Whereas the gracilis prefers to mate in the late summer. So these species differ in terms of their mating time preference, and hence they present an example of seasonal isolation here. Remember, besides this seasonal isolation, there can be temporal with respect to daytime or nighttime. They can be temporal with respect to years and so on. So there is a variety within this category which can exist or which can be represented by different organisms. Now let us move ahead to the next category where the potential mates have already met with each other. So there is no geographical or habitat or seasonal barriers as such, or they have crossed these barriers. They have met with each other, but they are unable to mate with each other still. What can be the barrier in those kind of species? That barrier is the ethological or behavioral, or we can say the psychological barrier or isolation. As the name suggests here, unlike all other previous barriers, there is no barrier with respect to which prohibits the meeting or which prohibits the timing and so on, but the behavior is such that they are not preferring to meet with each other. For example, the courtship behaviors. Courtship behavior is for attracting mates which are unique to a species and poses an effective reproductive barrier even in the closely related species. For example, the visual, the olfactory, tactile or auditory signals help in the species recognition. So if two species recognize with each other with all these signals, they can discriminate, they can discard the members of other species to mate with each other. These courtship behaviors are quite unique in terms of species recognition. For example, in case of Galapagos, blue-footed boobies, they mate only after a courtship display that is unique to their species. So if the other member of which is belonging to some other species, they show some courtship behavior and this particular member is not recognizing that other member as the member of its own species, they are not going to mate with that. So they are having specific courtship behavior with which they identify who is the member of my species and they mate with those only. So such kind of ethological or behavioral isolation mechanisms or barriers do exist in the organisms or different species. Moving ahead, let's assume that two species have crossed this as well. So there is no geographical barriers which prohibits mating. There is no ethological barrier which inhibits mating. And if these barriers are not there, there is a possibility that copulation will take place. That means mating will take place between the potential mates. Even if mating has taken place or copulation has occurred, there is a possibility that sperms are not transferred to the ovum. That means two of the gametes have not met with each other. What can be the barriers in this category? The first barrier which can lie in this category is called as mechanical isolation. Different and complex structures of genital organs in different organisms does not allow copulation to occur between different species. Remember, all species do have genital organs which are specific for that species. Means they do not allow copulation with the members of other species. Some evolutionary biologist has given an analogy just like a lock and key process. So just like lock and key match with each other, the members of the same species have genital organs in this format so that these members only mate with each other. For example, you can take the mollusk Bradybaena. In Bradybaena, shell spiraling in opposite direction causes misalignment of genital opening, and this mismatch or misalignment of genital opening prohibits copulation. Here you can see if these are the two Bradybaena species shells and the spiraling is in opposite direction, so their genital opening are in totally opposite directions. There is no alignment with each other, and hence even if they are meeting with each other, even they are trying to mate with each other, there is no successful transfer of sperms from one organism to the ovum of another organism. So there is a mismatch or misalignment, and this barrier we call it as mechanical isolation, which lies in the category where the copulation is being attempted but sperms are not being transferred to the ovum. Another example or category within this type of barrier can be gametic isolation. Even if mating has occurred, that means the copulation has occurred, sperms and ova, that is the gametes from different species, are not fertilized. For example, in case of sea urchins, gametes are released in surrounding water where they are living, where they fuse and produce the zygotes. But gametes which are belonging to different species, let's say red and purple ones, sea urchins, are unable to fuse with each other. Means the sperms and ovum do recognize each other. If they belong to same species, they do fertilize with each other. If sperm is from other species, ovum is from other species, they are unable to recognize with each other, they are unable to fertilize each other. And that is the case of gametic isolation, which generally in other sense we can say lately results in the gametic mortality. So obviously if sperms and ovum are not fertilizing with each other and no further development taking place, they are going to die because all of them do have a shelf life. So this kind of barrier also exists within this category and we call them as gametic isolation. Now the gametic isolation can lead to gametic mortality because of two factors. Either it can be a physiological barrier or they can be the biochemical barriers. For example, if the sperms are unable to survive in the reproductive tract of female of another species, if it is a internal kind of hybridization or internal kind of fertilization, in that case sperms are unable to survive in the chemical environment or the physiological environment of the female reproductive tract which is belonging to some other species. This can be a physiological barrier. Sperms are unable to penetrate the membrane surrounding the egg of another species because the sperm has to penetrate these membranes in order to reach towards the nucleus of ovum. So if they are unable to penetrate those membranes, they are not able to reach to the nucleus for the process of fertilization, and this is a sort of biochemical mechanisms or biochemical barrier, because all these fertilizing anti-fertilizing reactions which you have read in developmental biology, they do occur in terms of biochemistry. So this kind of physiological and biochemical barriers can exist which lead to gametic mortality, and thus they pose a gametic isolation barriers. Now, once if two species have members of two species have crossed all these barriers, all these prezygotic barriers, and the zygote has formed, there is another set of barriers which are called as post-zygotic barriers. These barriers do not allow to develop a viable, fertile adult from a hybrid zygote. In that, first category can be if egg is fertilized but zygote is not viable. So mating is there, fertilization is there, but the zygote which has formed, it is not viable. The first category here can be a sort of zygotic mortality. Both mating and fertilization is successful here, but the zygote is unable to develop. For example, if sheep and goat mate with each other, fertilization is possible, but the zygote that forms, it does not develop properly, and thus it is not viable. So it leads to zygotic mortality. Though it has crossed all these earlier barriers, still zygote is unable to develop here, and thus further development is not possible. So this is an example of zygotic mortality here. The next barrier can be if the zygote produces the F1 hybrid. So zygotic development is also there, zygote is viable, it has produced the F1 hybrid, but the viability of F1 hybrid is very much less or reduced time. Means the hybrid is not going to survive much. This is called as reduced hybrid viability. Impaired development and reduced viability is seen in hybrids due to interaction of genes from different parent species. Because their parents are coming from two different species, the hybrids which are forming because of them, they either do have problems with their development, so their development is impaired and their viability is very much reduced. For example, the salamander subspecies of genus Encetina live in the same region and habitats where occasionally they may hybridize. But the hybrids which are produced, they do not develop or are very much frail. Frail as in very much thin and which are unable to survive much. So the salamander subspecies of genus Encetina, which you can see, there are different subspecies within this salamander. They do stay at the same place, and because of which they do hybridize, because there are no other barriers existing in that particular case. So they do hybridize. The hybrid which is formed, they are very much reduced viable. So their development is impaired and their viability is compromised. The next category here is if F1 hybrid is viable but partially or completely sterile. So here zygote has survived, hybrid has survived, but the F1 hybrid which is there, it is partially or completely sterile. So that means it cannot give you the offspring further. And this kind of barrier is called as reduced hybrid fertility. Even if vigorous hybrids are produced, they might be sterile. This happens because of difference in number and structure of chromosomes in different parental species. Meiosis in hybrids fail to produce normal gametes. The famous example you can have here is of the mule. Mule is a sterile hybrid which is formed by horse and donkey. Though it is quite vigorous, the hybrid is very strong enough, it has survived, but it is sterile. That means it cannot produce its offspring further, and it happens because of the difference in the number and the structures of chromosomes which are coming from different species, that is from horse and from donkey here, and because of which there is a problem with the meiosis in the hybrids, and that is why they are unable to produce normal gametes. The last category still can be, even if the hybrid has survived, hybrid is fertile. The progenies which are coming from the hybrid, that means the F2 generation onwards, they are not fertile or they are not viable. So this category is called as reduced viability and fertility in the progenies of hybrids. That means beyond F1 generation, the problem arises with the F2 progenies or generation, and the phenomena we call it as hybrid breakdown. Sometimes the hybrids of first generation are viable and fertile as well, but their F2 generation after mating with each other or with their parents are very feeble or sterile. For example, the cultivated rice strains have accumulated different mutant recessive alleles at two loci during their divergence from a common ancestor. The hybrids in F1 are viable and they are fertile as well. But the F2 which is coming from these F1, they do carry too many of these recessive alleles, and thus they are very much small in size and sterile. So this is an example of hybrid background where up till F1 generation everything is fine. There is a viable fertile hybrid is formed. But the progenies which are coming out of these hybrids, that is the F2 generation onwards, the problem arises and this leads to hybrid breakdown. So these are all the what we can say the barriers which have occurred for two species in order to breed with each other to give viable and fertile offsprings. If two species cross all these barriers, all these 11-12 barriers which we have discussed so far, they are going to have viable and fertile offspring. So there will be success towards reproduction if they pass all these barriers. But if they are not, that is the case with most of the species. That means which maintains the identity of species as separate. Now, once we have discussed all these isolation and isolating mechanism, let us move to the last part of our lecture. We have seen what do we mean by speciation. We have seen various modes of speciation. Then we also discussed how the barriers or the isolating mechanisms operate in terms of geographical isolation or reproductive isolation. Now let us talk about the speed or the tempo of speciation. How at what speed this speciation takes place, how evolution occurs at this speciation speed. And for that there are two models which we can discuss here. One is called as gradualism model and another one is called as punctuated equilibrium model. The gradualism model or the gradualism is the case where from a common ancestor descended species gradually diverge more and more in their morphology by acquiring unique adaptations. For example, let us say we are moving from here to here with time. This is the ancestral species which is the common ancestor, and these all are descendant from this common ancestor. These descendants gradually diverge more and more. So if you compare this one from this one, or this one from this one, and so on, they have diverged more and more in their morphology because of acquisition of unique adaptations. So this common ancestor has descended or diverged in different directions and in terms of morphology because of acquisition of unique characters, and these slow changes are there in terms of morphology. This phenomena is called as gradualism, where we can see the in-between stages which are gradually changing and descendants are originating from the ancestral species. In contrast, there is a phenomena which is called as punctuated equilibrium. As per the fossil records, new species appear suddenly in a geological stratum, persist essentially unchanged through many strata, and then disappear apparently. Means, if this is the ancestral species, the new species from this arise suddenly in some geographical strata, and then for a long time it remains unchanged, that is in the stasis position, and then suddenly it disappears. Niles Eldredge and Stephen G. Gould explained punctuated equilibrium to describe these periods of apparent stasis, punctuated by sudden change. This is the name which has come from the punctuated equilibrium. Periods of apparent stasis, that means where no change is taking place. Punctuated means suddenly, just like a punctuation, a sort of break, there is a sudden change which exists and the new species arises. This phenomena is called as punctuated equilibrium. And as you can see here, if this is the common ancestral species, from here in between you don't see anything. So these are the phases of stasis which you can see here in these gaps. And then suddenly from here these two species arise. From here these two different forms do arise. So these are just like a punctuation toward along apparently stasis mode. Here you can see a contrasting figure for punctuated equilibrium and the phyletic graduation. In case of phyletic graduation, tends to show transitional fossils and evidence evolution. In between transitional forms are there of which we call as transitional fossils. Whereas in case of punctuated equilibrium, it tends to omit the transitional fossils and thus masks the evolution. So these two figures characteristically show how the two different modes of or tempo of evolution or speciation takes place. The red dots here which you see are representing the fossils. Here you can see differentiating points between gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. The hypothesis that evolution proceeds by imperceptibly small cumulative steps over long period of time rather than by abrupt and major changes is called as gradualism. Whereas in case of punctuated equilibrium, the hypothesis says that evolutionary development is marked by isolated episodes of rapid speciation between long periods of little or no change or stasis. Gradualism brings small variation to a particular species, whereas punctuated equilibrium emphasizes consistent and cumulative changes to a species. Gradualism occurs over a long period of time, whereas punctuated equilibrium occurs within a short period of time. Gradualism describes evolution as a slow process because there are small changes which is being accumulated over time. Whereas in case of punctuated equilibrium, it brings out short events which speed up the slow evolution. Though graduation is not proven by fossil records, punctuated equilibrium in terms of fossils is better model to describe evolution. So with this, we come to the summary part of our lecture. In today's lecture, we talked about evolutionary change or the patterns of evolution. which can be either anagenesis, that is in one lineage or in one linear direction, or the cladogenesis, which is sort of branching. And we also discussed that it is the cladogenesis which brings out the biological diversity because it introduces more and more new species. We also discussed about speciation, so origin of new species, and there are 4 different modes of this speciation to occur. It can be allopatric in nature, which is because of the geographical barriers or isolation. It can be sympatric in nature, which is of reproductive isolation or barrier types. Then there are 2 more categories within the geographical isolation, which are called as parapatric and peripatric speciation. Later, we discussed various isolating mechanisms. Different classification mechanisms are there as given by various evolutionary biologists. Particularly, we talked about the Mackham's classification, and we categorized all these barriers in 2 main categories, the prezygotic and the post-zygotic, or pre-mating and the post-mating type of reproductive barriers or isolating mechanisms, where we discussed stepwise how two species approach with each other, how potential mates meet with each other, then mate with each other, then copulate with each other, whether fertilization is happening or not, whether zygote is forming or not, whether hybrid is viable, fertile, or F2 is fertile or not. So depending on these different stages, we categorize different isolating mechanisms. We also discussed lastly about the tempo or speed of speciation, which can be either the gradualism or the phyletic evolution, or it can be the punctuated equilibrium. Now with this, I would like you to suggest all these books by Ridley, Holland Holgrensen, and Douglas J. Futuyama on evolution, and a common book by Campbell and Rees on biology, which gives a good uh, images in terms of evolution or speciation particularly. With this, I would like to thank you all.